Okay, yeah, in my professional life, I run a training company, and in my voluntary life, let's say, I work also in training, amongst other things, in stress relief, in post-traumatic stress relief, as well as in general personal development. So what I did was I picked a couple of the topics that Ralph had mentioned. One is this Wulkan, you know, the Volcano reference, and the other thing is that things that are impossible can be doable. And so I'm going to talk about the role of natural disasters in human and in our civilizational development. First off, just to talk about the title, a natural disaster. This is a common phrase, a natural disaster, natural calamity. Is it natural? What does it imply? That means that we couldn't have done anything to avoid it, right? Otherwise we'd call it a human tragedy, right? Would you say that the tragedy that happened in Haiti, right, was that a natural disaster, or could we have done something? Right? So it's natural is a kind of like an exculpation, right? It's like a cop-out, like trying to put the guilt on somebody else. Yeah? If we had, is it impossible to imagine an international community that is that close, that, for example, Haiti had the same degree of earthquake prevention, say, that California has? Is that impossible? No, it's very doable, right? Okay, so first the term, you know, bad term, natural disaster. As I mentioned, I often deal with people who have been through some kind of traumatic experience, and one of the functions of the organization I work for in a voluntary manner is to deal with post-traumatic development of people. One of the things that people in that situation often say is, why did it happen to me? Right? Why did it happen to me? People who get depressed say that a lot. They make more general statements. They say things like, why does this always happen to me? You know, a bit more scientific, you know, make a generalization. You know, why does this always happen to me? People who are interested in theological, intellectual, philosophical, historical debates ask questions like, how could a benevolent and omnipotent God allow natural disasters to happen at all, right? And that's also one of the questions that people sometimes ask themselves when they're going through that. They ask themselves very deep questions. I want to remain totally neutral on the kind of, you know, atheist, religious, this kind of question. But I'd like to point out that, just for a first stop, that seems to be a bad argument, like a bad question. It's a bit like asking parents, how could you allow your child to have any painful experience whatsoever? Why can't you arrange it so that your kids just have a perfectly easy and nice life? It's a bit like asking that question. I'm just throwing that out as an idea to think of. A lot of the things I'll say, I don't want to impose an opinion. I want you just to have a think about it. Now, I got a bit less. Can I get a note? Yeah. Sorry, I lost my drift. I'll just get a note.
We're calling this a workshop, incidentally. So audience participation will be required, and questions will be asked. So remember.
Yeah. Intellectuals. What I want to say is that people who are going through natural disasters, people who have suffered natural disasters or tragedies, are very similar in their approach to intellectuals. Intellectuals often, it's a common opinion that there's certain events in the world, genocide, for example, absolutely evil events, right, that we cannot attribute any meaning to. It's almost a kind of disrespect. You know, that's an opinion you sometimes hear from the kind of intellectual reaction to those type of events. There's almost like a kind of respect expressed in the idea that they are meaningless. However, it's ironic that it's also in the area of intelligentsia where we find a very clear meaning ascribed to tragedy and natural disaster. Think about the word tragedy in terms of art, right? In Greek, Shakespeare, and there's a very clear meaning in tragedy. What is the meaning? The hero, the tragic hero, doesn't see certain facts. He's not aware of certain things, or he's arrogant, he makes certain mistakes, and he comes to be wise through the tragic events, and before he dies, which he does, he'll be wise. He'll realize who is loyal to him, who really loves him, that he can't run the world the way he thought he could, he can't be so arrogant, he's humbled before he dies. But he pays for this knowledge with his life. So it's very, very expensive training. That's one way to look at the tragedy. Now think about the role of natural disasters, the title I already questioned. Here's a few facts, just for you to think over. What meaning do you find in the following events? In 1918, the First World War ended. In the aftermath of the First World War, many welfare states were set up. Rights were often expanded in societies. For example, in the UK, it used to be the case previous to the First World War that women didn't have the same voting rights as men. It was considered that women until about the age of 30 were too silly or irresponsible to be given the vote. But because of the First World War, the guys were all over fighting, women were running the factories. So if you can manage like an arms industry, then you obviously can vote, right? So pensions were introduced after the Second World War, 1945. Again, unprecedented tragedy. United Nations and European Union were set up. Organizations explicitly founded out of a kind of horror of what people had gone through. Another fact. Another fact, people who go through personal tragedies often ask themselves very deep questions, like, what am I doing with my life? I know someone who lost their daughter like 2 or 3 years ago, and she asked herself, she's very successful in her professional life, and she asked herself, what am I doing with my life? What is the meaning of, for example, the fact that I have phenomenal success in business, as she does? And it caused her to ask questions like, who is benefiting from my talent and my hard work? Asking deep questions. What's the purpose of it? Oh, another fact. For sure you know this. In 2001, 3,000 people died in New York. Not just the fact that this fact I want you to be aware of, but the fact that you're very well aware of it. You might be less aware of the fact that 2 years earlier in Venezuela, the country I was born in, I'm not preaching, I'm just, the fact that I know about the Venezuelan tragedy is because I'm from there. Approximately 10 times that number of people died in a mudslide in 1999. So I want you to think about what does it mean, the fact that there was a tragedy in New York, and what does it mean the fact that you know about it, that you've heard of it? So these are several facts that I want you to think about, what it means for you, these tragedies. Here's just a few suggestions. One is that sometimes in life we are just so insensitive. I'm going to put it a little bluntly, we're that insensitive and unaware of what other people in the world think and are going through and what their opinion is, that we need to wait for someone to drive a plane into our economic center before we ask ourselves the questions. Many ordinary Americans ask themselves this question: really, there are people out there who don't like us that much? That is just an incredible level of insensitivity. So it's a kind of wake-up call, a bit like the tragedy. Okay. Another thing is an expanding sense of humanity. There's a kind of implicit racism, I would say, in the way that media and our emotions, we shouldn't exempt ourselves, present natural disasters in different parts of the world. The 3,000 US and European citizens, in terms of media and in terms of our emotional response, are roughly equivalent to 100,000 Haitians, 100,000 Chinese. So do we really believe in our constitutions? Do we really believe in equality? So ask yourself the question, what is your emotional response when you saw, 3,000 Americans or say 100,000 Haitians or 100,000 Chinese or 30,000 Venezuelans? Okay, so these are questions that they pose. Just to sum up, I would draw just two very broad conclusions. Another false assumption that we make when we think about tragedies, and also when we go through them, another false assumption that makes them more painful, is that we tend to assume that life is linear. We tend to assume that we're going to go from just like pretty good to better. That's how our life is going to go. Okay, I've got a friend right now who had a tragic situation. Two members of his family died suddenly. That was a brother and a mum. He was in a pretty good situation, materially, educationally, generally he was in a good situation. Right now, his life offers him two choices. He can become like a pillar, a really strong person. He's actually going to become a trainer for post-traumatic stress relief. So he can become an extremely strong person, like a leader in the community, or he can get totally depressed and drop out. The just okay option isn't there anymore. So that's one assumption that we tend to make. Our life will be just linear, and it isn't always. And the last, I'd like to mention a very good personal trainer from the East. It was called Buddha. He said that there's two ways that we'll get wise. We will get wise, he said. We will become smart, all of us. We got the fast track, fast lane. That is when we realize from others' experiences mistakes that we could make, and we avoid them. Right? Then we'll be Polak mądry przed szkodą. Okay. Or there is the other one, the Polak po szkodzie. That's the slow lane. You know, that's when we have to learn by our own mistakes. You know, that's the slower path to being wise. And I should add that there's probably a third track, a third lane. That is the people or the countries who become wise or learn the lessons after repeating the same mistake many, many times before learning it. So the conclusion is that tragedy does have a meaning in the same way that it does in art. It's a wake-up call. It's making us more sensitive to things that are happening in the world, but it is the slower track, and we ought all to be the Polak mądry przed szkodą.